Hi, it's Leah Litman from Strict Scrutiny in my showgirl era, here to explain to you the recent ruling concerning the Trump administration's deployment of the National Guard to Oregon. So, on Saturday night, a district judge in Oregon issued a pretty epic opinion that concluded that Donald Trump's deployment of the Oregon National Guard in Portland, Oregon was illegal. The administration responded to that ruling through evasion. Specifically, they tried to deploy the Texas National Guard to Portland. The judge was not happy and found that illegal too. I'm going to try to break this all down. So, we've all been following the news and stories about how the president is deploying or threatening to deploy the National Guard to a variety of locations, often blue cities like Los Angeles or Chicago. And he's doing so, or so he says, because in those places, he claims federal officers aren't able to enforce federal immigration law because of protests in those locations. So under federal law, the president is able to federalize, that is, call up the National Guard in cases where, without the National Guard, federal officers are unable to, quote, execute federal law. But in those circumstances, the National Guard is only supposed to be able to protect federal personnel or federal places. That is, the National Guard isn't themselves allowed to enforce federal immigration law. The military isn't allowed to engage in ordinary domestic law enforcement. Now, the president's bases for calling up and deploying the National Guard stink and stunk to high heaven. So immigration officers are able to enforce and execute federal immigration law. They're doing so in conjunction with other federal law enforcement officers. The fact that people are protesting federal immigration law enforcement doesn't change that. Nor does the fact that a handful of protesters might be breaking laws, as part of their protests, say by damaging federal property or even assaulting an officer. Why is that? Because there's no evidence that federal officers can't address that themselves, or that regular state and local police can't either when people break laws. Or put another way, the mere fact that some people are violating the law doesn't mean the president gets to deploy the National Guard, or he'd be allowed to deploy the National Guard and turn the military on Americans all the time. Again, because sometimes people violate the laws. That is just how things work. That has never been thought to justify the president's deployment of the military before. So Portland, Oregon was the latest target of Trump's use of the National Guard, and on Saturday night, a district judge found the deployment illegal. Specifically, the court concluded that Trump didn't have a basis to say the National Guard was necessary to ensure that federal law was executed or enforced, or that executing federal law, again, immigration law, wasn't possible without the National Guard. As the district judge wrote, quote, "After June, the protests were generally peaceful in nature, with only sporadic incidents of violence and disruptive behavior. By late September, these protests typically involved 20 or fewer people." So the court concluded that the president was wrong to deploy the National Guard because he didn't actually have a basis to think that deploying the National Guard was necessary to execute federal law. So the court wrote that the president's own statements indicated that his determination that deploying the National Guard was necessary to execute federal law was not conceived in good faith. The court also wrote, quote, "The president's determination was simply untethered to the facts, ignored facts on the ground, and was based largely on a fictional narrative." Oh, and the judge who wrote this, that judge was appointed by Donald Trump. And the judge previously, before becoming a judge, had served on Ken Starr's team that had investigated the Clintons. So this is a Republican appointee with very solid Republican credentials. After the ruling, White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller, a.k.a. C+ Santa Monica fascist, or Pee Wee German, went berserk. He escalated the administration's war on lower courts, fanning the flames, even as lower court judges who rule against the Trump administration face a rising number of threats to their lives and their families' lives. So Miller wrote on Twitter, quote, "Legal insurrection. The president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, not an Oregon judge." He also claimed that this is an organized terrorist attack on the federal government, and the deployment of troops is an absolute necessity to defend our laws, our government, public order, and the republic itself. So this is, again, part of the broad effort by the administration to delegitimize the lower federal courts. And the administration decided it would kind of give the federal courts a big middle finger. Specifically, after the district judge in Oregon determined that calling up the Oregon National Guard and deploying them in Portland would be illegal, the administration said, fine, okay, we'll just call up the Texas National Guard. Huh? That is still illegal. The court said there wasn't a reason to believe the National Guard was needed. It doesn't matter if that National Guard is coming from Oregon or Texas. Also, sending one state's National Guard to invade another is basically an administration-orchestrated civil fucking war. The administration has done this stepping back, changing one irrelevant fact around in a bunch of cases to get around court orders, basically forcing the courts to play whack-a-mole, as we've talked about on strict scrutiny, just to give you another example. So they told one judge, "Oh, judge, you said that the Department of Homeland Security couldn't deport people to El Salvador, so we had the Department of Defense do it." Again, it doesn't matter if the deportations are illegal. They're illegal no matter which department is carrying them out. The judge in this Oregon case concerning the National Guard was not happy. She called a hearing late Sunday night to determine whether the administration was violating her order. Spoiler, if a judge calls a Sunday night emergency hearing to figure out if your having tried to start a civil war violates a court order, things aren't looking great for you. The judge almost immediately began the hearing by saying, "How is this not a violation of my order?" Talking to the government's lawyer, "You're an officer of the court. How is this not circumvention?" Because the order was based on conditions in Portland. And if those conditions don't justify the deployment of the Oregon National Guard, they certainly don't justify sending and relocating the Texas National Guard either. So at the conclusion of the hearing, the district judge found that redeploying the Texas National Guard to Portland did indeed violate her order and was indeed illegal for the same reasons that calling up the Oregon National Guard was. And the judge expanded her previous ruling to prevent the administration from not only deploying the Oregon National Guard, but also prohibiting the administration from relocating or deploying any federalized National Guard to Oregon based on current conditions. So that is a quick summary of the developments in Oregon. Listen in to Strict Scrutiny. New episodes drop every Monday as we break down more developments in these cases, as well as cases at the Supreme Court and other legal news.